The wrong shape. Certain of the great roads going north out of London continue, far into the country, a sort of attenuated and interrupted spectre of a street, with great gaps in the building, but preserving the line. Here will be a group of shops, followed by a fenced field or paddock, and then a famous public house, and then perhaps a market garden or a nursery garden, and then one large private house, and then another field and another inn, and so on. If anyone walks along one of these roads, he will pass a house which will probably catch his eye, though he may not be able to explain its attraction. It is a long, low house, running parallel with the road, painted mostly white and pale green, with a veranda and sunblinds, and porches capped with those quaint sort of cupolas like wooden umbrellas that one sees in some old-fashioned houses. In fact, it is an old-fashioned house, very English and very suburban in the good old wealthy Clapham sense. And yet the house has a look of having been built chiefly for the hot weather. Looking at its white paint and sun-blinds, one thinks vaguely of pugries, and even of palm trees. I cannot trace the feeling to its root. Perhaps the place was built by an Anglo-Indian. Anyone passing this house, I say, would be namelessly fascinated by it, would feel that it was a place about which some story was to be told. And he would have been right, as you shall shortly hear. For this is the story of the strange things that did really happen in it in the Whitsuntide of the year 1800 and... Anyone passing the house on the Thursday before Whit Sunday at about 4:30 p.m. would have seen the front door open and Father Brown of the small church of St. Mungo come out smoking a large pipe, in company with a very tall French friend of his called Flambeau, who was smoking a very small cigarette. These persons may or may not be of interest to the reader, but the truth is that they were not the only interesting things that were displayed when the front door of the white and green house was opened. There are further peculiarities about this house which must be described to start with, not only that the reader may understand this tragic tale, but also that he may realize what it was that the opening of the door revealed. The whole house was built upon the plan of a T, but a T with a very long cross-piece and a very short tail-piece. The long cross-piece was the frontage that ran along in face of the street, with the front door in the middle. It was 2 stories high and contained nearly all the important rooms. The short tail-piece, which ran out at the back, immediately opposite the front door, was 1 story high, and consisted only of 2 long rooms, the one leading into the other. The first of these 2 rooms was the study, in which the celebrated Mr. Quinton wrote his wild oriental poems and romances. The farther room was a glass conservatory, full of tropical blossoms of quite unique and almost monstrous beauty, and on such afternoons as these, glowing with gorgeous sunlight. Thus, when the hall door was open, many a passer-by literally stopped to stare and gasp, for he looked down a perspective of rich apartments to something really like a transformation scene in a fairy play, purple clouds and golden suns and crimson stars that were at once scorchingly vivid and yet transparent and far away. Leonard Quinton, the poet, had himself most carefully arranged this effect, and it is doubtful whether he so perfectly expressed his personality in any of his poems. For he was a man who drank and bathed in colours, who indulged his lust for colour somewhat to the neglect of form, even of good form. This it was that had turned his genius so wholly to Eastern art and imagery. to those bewildering carpets or blinding embroideries in which all the colours seem fallen into a fortunate chaos, having nothing to typify or to teach. He had attempted, not perhaps with complete artistic success, but with acknowledged imagination and invention, to compose epics and love stories reflecting the riot of violent and even cruel colour. Tales of tropical heavens of burning gold or blood-red copper, of Eastern heroes who rode with 12 turbaned mitres upon elephants painted purple or peacock green, of gigantic jewels that 100 negroes could not carry, but which burned with ancient and strange-hued fires. In short, to put the matter from the more common point of view, he dealt much in Eastern heavens, rather worse than most Western hells. In Eastern monarchs, whom we might possibly call maniacs, and in Eastern jewels, which a Bond Street jeweller, if the 100 staggering negroes brought them into his shop, might possibly not regard as genuine. Quinton was a genius, if a morbid one, and even his morbidity appeared more in his life than in his work. In temperament, he was weak and waspish, and his health had suffered heavily from Oriental experiments with opium. His wife, a handsome, hard-working, and indeed overworked woman, objected to the opium, but objected much more to a live Indian hermit in white and yellow robes, whom her husband insisted on entertaining for months together, a Virgil, to guide his spirit through the heavens and hells of the East. It was out of this artistic household that Father Brown and his friend stepped onto the doorstep. And to judge from their faces, they stepped out of it with much relief. Flambeau had known Quinton in wild student days in Paris, and they had renewed the acquaintance for a weekend. But apart from Flambeau's more responsible developments of late, he did not get on well with the poet now. Choking oneself with opium and writing little erotic verses on vellum was not his notion of how a gentleman should go to the devil. As the two paused on the doorstep before taking a turn in the garden, the front garden gate was thrown open with violence, and a young man with a billycock hat on the back of his head tumbled up the steps in his eagerness. He was a dissipated-looking youth, with a gorgeous red necktie all awry, as if he had slept in it, and he kept fidgeting and lashing about with one of those little jointed canes. "I say," he said breathlessly, "I want to see old Quinton. I must see him. Has he gone?" "Mr. Quinton is in, I believe," said Father Brown, cleaning his pipe, "but I do not know if you can see him. The doctor is with him at present." The young man, who seemed not to be perfectly sober, stumbled into the hall, and at the same moment the doctor came out of Quinton's study, shutting the door and beginning to put on his gloves. "See Mr. Quinton?" said the doctor coolly. "No, I'm afraid you can't. In fact, you mustn't on any account. Nobody must see him. I've just given him his sleeping draught." "No, but look here, old chap," said the youth in the red tie, trying affectionately to capture the doctor by the lapels of his coat. "Look here, I'm simply sewn up, I tell you. "It's no good, Mr. Atkinson," said the doctor, forcing him to fall back. "When you can alter the effects of a drug, I'll alter my decision." And settling on his hat, he stepped out into the sunlight with the other two. He was a bull-necked, good-tempered little man with a small moustache, inexpressibly ordinary, yet giving an impression of capacity. The young man in the billycock, who did not seem to be gifted with any tact in dealing with people, beyond the general idea of clutching hold of their coats, stood outside the door as dazed as if he had been thrown out bodily, and silently watched the other three walk away together through the garden. "That was a sound, spanking lie I told just now," remarked the medical man, laughing. "In point of fact, poor Quinton doesn't have his sleeping draught for nearly half an hour, but I'm not going to have him bothered with that little beast, who only wants to borrow money that he wouldn't pay back if he could. He's a dirty little scamp, though he is Mrs. Quinton's brother, and she is as fine a woman as ever walked." "Yes," said Father Brown. "She's a good woman."
"So I propose to hang about the garden till the creature is cleared off," went on the doctor, "and then I'll go into Quinton with the medicine. Atkinson can't get in because I locked the door." "In that case, Dr. Harris," said Flambeau, "we might as well walk round at the back by the end of the conservatory. There's no entrance to it that way, but it's worth seeing even from the outside." "Yes, and I might get a squint at my patient," laughed the doctor, "for he prefers to lie on an ottoman right at the end of the conservatory amid all those blood-red poinsettias. It would give me the creeps. But what are you doing?"
Father Brown had stopped for a moment, and picked up out of the long grass, where it had almost been wholly hidden, a queer, crooked, oriental knife, inlaid exquisitely in coloured stones and metals. "What is this?" asked Father Brown, regarding it with some disfavour.
"Oh, Quinton's, I suppose," said Dr. Harris carelessly. "He has all sorts of Chinese knick-knacks about the place. Or perhaps it belongs to that mild Hindu of his whom he keeps on a string."
"What Hindu?" asked Father Brown, still staring at the dagger in his hand.
"Oh, some Indian conjurer," said the doctor lightly. "A fraud, of course."
"You don't believe in magic?" asked Father Brown, without looking up.
"Oh, crikey! Magic!" said the doctor.
"It's very beautiful," said the priest in a low, dreaming voice. "The colours are very beautiful. But it's the wrong shape."
"What for?" asked Flambeau, staring.
"For anything. It's the wrong shape in the abstract. Don't you ever feel that about Eastern art? The colours are intoxicatingly lovely, but the shapes are mean and bad, deliberately mean and bad. I have seen wicked things in a Turkey carpet."
"Mon Dieu!" cried Flambeau, laughing.
"They are letters and symbols in a language I don't know, but I know they stand for evil words," went on the priest, his voice growing lower and lower. "The lines go wrong on purpose, like serpents doubling to escape."
"What the devil are you talking about?" said the doctor with a loud laugh.
Flambeau spoke quietly to him in answer.
"The father sometimes gets this mystic's cloud on him," he said, "but I give you fair warning that I have never known him to have it except when there was some evil quite near." "Oh, rats!" said the scientist.
"Why, look at it!" cried Father Brown, holding out the crooked knife at arm's length as if it were some glittering snake. "Don't you see it is the wrong shape? Don't you see that it has no hearty and plain purpose? It does not point like a spear. It does not sweep like a scythe. It does not look like a weapon. It looks like an instrument of torture."
"Well, as you don't seem to like it," said the jolly Harris, "it had better be taken back to its owner. Haven't we come to the end of this confounded conservatory yet? This house is the wrong shape, if you like."
"You don't understand," said Father Brown, shaking his head. "The shape of this house is quaint, it is even laughable, but there is nothing wrong about it." As they spoke, they came round the curve of glass that ended the conservatory, an uninterrupted curve, for there was neither door nor window by which to enter at that end. The glass, however, was clear, and the sun still bright, though beginning to set, and they could see not only the flamboyant blossoms inside, but the frail figure of the poet, in a brown velvet coat, lying languidly on the sofa, having apparently fallen half asleep over a book. He was a pale, slight man, with loose chestnut hair and a fringe of beard that was the paradox of his face, for the beard made him look less manly. These traits were well known to all three of them, but even had it not been so, it may be doubted whether they would have looked at Quinton just then. Their eyes were riveted on another object. Exactly in their path, Immediately outside the round end of the glass building was standing a tall man, whose drapery fell to his feet in faultless white, and whose bare brown skull, face, and neck gleamed in the setting sun like splendid bronze. He was looking through the glass at the sleeper, and he was more motionless than a mountain. "Who is that?" cried Father Brown, stepping back with a hissing intake of his breath.
"Oh, it is only that Hindu humbug," growled Harris. "But I don't know what the deuce he's doing here."
"It looks like hypnotism," said Flambeau, biting his black moustache.
"Why are you unmedical fellows always talking bosh about hypnotism?" cried the doctor. "It looks a deal more like burglary."
"Well, we will speak to it, at any rate," said Flambeau, who was always for action. One long stride took him to the place where the Indian stood. Bowing from his great height, which overtopped even the Orientals, he said with placid impudence, "Good evening, sir. Do you want anything?" Quite slowly, like a great ship turning into a harbour, the great yellow face turned and looked at last over its white shoulder. They were startled to see that its yellow eyelids were quite sealed, as in sleep. "Thank you," said the face in excellent English. "I want nothing." Then, half opening the lids so as to show a slit of opalescent eyeball, he repeated, "I want nothing." Then he opened his eyes wide with a startling stare, said, "I want nothing," and went rustling away into the rapidly darkening garden. "The Christian is more modest," muttered Father Brown. "He wants something."
"What on earth was he doing?" asked Flambeau, knitting his black brows and lowering his voice.
"I should like to talk to you later," said Father Brown. The sunlight was still a reality, but it was the red light of evening, and the bulk of the garden trees and bushes grew blacker and blacker against it. They turned round the end of the conservatory and walked in silence down the other side to get round to the front door. As they went, they seemed to wake something, as one startles a bird, in the deeper corner between the study and the main building, and again they saw the white-robed fakir slide out of the shadow and slip round towards the front door. To their surprise, however, he had not been alone. They found themselves abruptly pulled up and forced to banish their bewilderment by the appearance of Mrs. Quinton, with her heavy golden hair and square pale face advancing on them out of the twilight. She looked a little stern, but was entirely courteous. "Good evening, Dr. Harris," was all she said.
"Good evening, Mrs. Quinton," said the little doctor heartily. "I'm just going to give your husband his sleeping draught."
"Yes," she said in a clear voice. "I think it is quite time." And she smiled at them, and went sweeping into the house. "That woman's overdriven," said Father Brown. "That's the kind of woman that does her duty for 20 years, and then does something dreadful." The little doctor looked at him, for the first time, with an eye of interest.
"Did you ever study medicine?" he asked.
"You have to know something of the mind as well as the body," answered the priest. "We have to know something of the body as well as the mind."
"Well," said the doctor, "I think I'll go and give Quinton his stuff."
They had turned the corner of the front facade and were approaching the front doorway. As they turned into it, they saw the man in the white robe for the third time. He came so straight towards the front door that it seemed quite incredible that he had not just come out of the study opposite to it. Yet they knew that the study door was locked. Father Brown and Flambeau, however, kept this weird contradiction to themselves, and Dr. Harris was not a man to waste his thoughts on the impossible. He permitted the omnipresent Asiatic to make his exit, and then stepped briskly into the hall. There he found a figure which he had already forgotten. The inane Atkinson was still hanging about, humming and poking things with his knobby cane. The doctor's face had a spasm of disgust and decision, and he whispered rapidly to his companion, "I must lock the door again, or this rat will get in. But I shall be out again in 2 minutes." He rapidly unlocked the door and locked it again behind him, just balking a blundering charge from the young man in the billycock. The young man threw himself impatiently on a hall chair. Flambeau looked at a Persian illumination on the wall. Father Brown, who seemed in a sort of daze, dully eyed the door. In about 4 minutes, the door was opened again. Atkinson was quicker this time. He sprang forward, held the door open for an instant, and called out, "Oh, I say, Quinton, I want—" From the other end of the study came the clear voice of Quinton, in something between a yawn and a yell of weary laughter. "Oh, I know what you want. Take it and leave me in peace. I'm writing a song about peacocks." Before the door closed, half a sovereign came flying through the aperture, and Atkinson, stumbling forward, caught it with singular dexterity. "So that's settled," said the doctor, and locking the door savagely, he led the way out into the garden. "Poor Leonard can get little peace now," he added to Father Brown. "He's locked in all by himself for an hour or two." "Yes," answered the priest, "and his voice sounded jolly enough when we left him." Then he looked gravely round the garden, and saw the loose figure of Atkinson standing and jingling the half-sovereign in his pocket, and beyond, in the purple twilight, the figure of the Indian, sitting bolt upright upon a bank of grass, with his face turned towards the setting sun. Then he said abruptly, "Where is Mrs. Quinton?" "She has gone up to her room," said the doctor. "That is her shadow on the blind." Father Brown looked up and frowningly scrutinized a dark outline at the gaslit window. "Yes," he said, "that is her shadow." And he walked a yard or two and threw himself upon a garden seat. Flambeau sat down beside him, but the doctor was one of those energetic people who live naturally on their legs. He walked away, smoking, into the twilight, and the two friends were left together. "My father," said Flambeau in French, "what is the matter with you?" Father Brown was silent and motionless for half a minute. Then he said, "Superstition is irreligious, but there is something in the air of this place. I think it's that Indian, at least partly." He sank into silence and watched the distant outline of the Indian, who still sat rigid as if in prayer. At first sight he seemed motionless, but as Father Brown watched him, he saw that the man swayed ever so slightly, with a rhythmic movement, just as the dark tree-tops swayed ever so slightly in the wind that was creeping up the dim garden paths and shuffling the fallen leaves a little. The landscape was growing rapidly dark, as if for a storm, but they could still see all the figures in their various places. Atkinson was leaning against a tree with a listless face. Quinton's wife was still at her window. The doctor had gone strolling round the end of the conservatory. They could see his cigar like a will-o'-the-wisp. And the fakir still sat rigid and yet rocking, while the trees above him began to rock and almost to roar. Storm was certainly coming. "When that Indian spoke to us," went on Brown in a conversational undertone, "I had a sort of vision. A vision of him and all his universe. Yet he only said the same thing 3 times. When first he said, 'I want nothing,' it meant only that he was impenetrable, that Asia does not give itself away. Then he said again, 'I want nothing,' and I knew that he meant that he was sufficient to himself, like a cosmos, that he needed no God, neither admitted any sins. And when he said the 3rd time, "I want nothing." He said it with blazing eyes, and I knew that he meant literally what he said, that nothing was his desire and his home, that he was weary for nothing, as for wine, that annihilation, the mere destruction of everything or anything— 2 drops of rain fell, and for some reason Flambeau started and looked up, as if they had stung him. And the same instant the doctor down by the end of the conservatory began running towards them, calling out something as he ran. As he came among them like a bombshell, the restless Atkinson happened to be taking a turn nearer to the house front, and the doctor clutched him by the collar in a convulsive grip. "Foul play!" he cried. "What have you been doing to him, you dog?" The priest had sprung erect and had the voice of steel, of a soldier in command. "No fighting," he cried coolly. "We are enough to hold anyone we want to. What is the matter, doctor?" "Things are not right with Quinton," said the doctor, quite white. "I could just see him through the glass, and I don't like the way he's lying. It's not as I left him, anyhow." "Let us go in to him," said Father Brown shortly. "You can leave Mr. Atkinson alone. I have had him in sight since we heard Quinton's voice."
"I will stop here and watch him," said Flambeau hurriedly. "You go in and see."
The doctor and the priest flew to the study door, unlocked it, and fell into the room. In doing so they nearly fell over the large mahogany table in the centre at which the poet usually wrote, for the place was lit only by a small fire kept for the invalid. In the middle of this table lay a single sheet of paper, evidently left there on purpose. The doctor snatched it up, glanced at it, handed it to Father Brown, and crying, "Good God, look at that!" plunged towards the glass room beyond, where the terrible tropic flowers still seemed to keep a crimson memory of the sunset. Father Brown read the words 3 times before he put down the paper. The words were, "I die by my own hand, yet I die murdered." They were in the quite inimitable, not to say illegible, handwriting of Leonard Quinton. Then Father Brown, still keeping the paper in his hand, strode towards the conservatory, only to meet his medical friend coming back with a face of assurance and collapse.
"He's done it," said Harris.
They went together through the gorgeous, unnatural beauty of cactus and azalea, and found Leonard Quinton, poet and romancer, with his head hanging downward off his ottoman, and his red curls sweeping the ground. Into his left side was thrust the queer dagger that they had picked up in the garden, and his limp hand still rested on the hilt. Outside, the storm had come at one stride, like the night in Coleridge, and garden and glass roof were darkened with driving rain. Father Brown seemed to be studying the paper more than the corpse. He held it close to his eyes and seemed to be trying to read it in the twilight. Then he held it up against the faint light, and as he did so, lightning stared at them for an instant, so white that the paper looked black against it. Darkness full of thunder followed, and after the thunder, Father Brown's voice said out of the dark, "Doctor, this paper is the wrong shape."
"What do you mean?"
asked Dr. Harris with a frowning stare. "It isn't square," answered Brown. "It has a sort of edge snipped off at the corner. What does it mean?"
"How the deuce should I know?" growled the doctor. "Shall we move this poor chap, do you think? He's quite dead."
"No," answered the priest. "We must leave him as he lies, and send for the police." But he was still scrutinizing the paper. As they went back through the study, he stopped by the table and picked up a small pair of nail scissors. "Ah," he said with a sort of relief, "this is what he did it with. But yet—" and he knitted his brows.
"Oh, stop fooling with that scrap of paper," said the doctor emphatically. "It was a fad of his. He had hundreds of them. He cut all his paper like that," as he pointed to a stack of sermon paper still unused on another and smaller table. Father Brown went up to it and held up a sheet. It was the same irregular shape. "Quite so," he said.
And here I see the corners that were snipped off." And to the indignation of his colleague, he began to count them. "That's all right," he said, with an apologetic smile. 23 sheets cut, and 22 corners cut off them, and as I see you are impatient, we will rejoin the others."
"Who is to tell his wife?" asked Dr. Harris. "Will you go and tell her now, while I send a servant for the police?"
"As you will," said Father Brown indifferently, and he went out to the hall door. Here also he found a drama, though of a more grotesque sort. It showed nothing less than his big friend Flambeau in an attitude to which he had long been unaccustomed, while upon the pathway at the bottom of the steps was sprawling, with his boots in the air, the amiable Atkinson, his billycock hat and walking cane sent flying in opposite directions along the path. Atkinson had at length wearied of Flambeau's almost paternal custody, and had endeavoured to knock him down, which was by no means a smooth game to play with the Roi des Apaches, even after that monarch's abdication. Flambeau was about to leap upon his enemy and secure him once more, when the priest patted him easily on the shoulder. "Make it up with Mr. Atkinson, my friend," he said. "Beg a mutual pardon, and say good night. We need not detain him any longer." Then, as Atkinson rose somewhat doubtfully and gathered his hat and stick and went towards the garden gate, Father Brown said in a more serious voice, "Where is that Indian?" They all three, for the doctor had joined them, turned involuntarily towards the dim grassy bank amid the tossing trees purple with twilight, where they had last seen the brown man swaying in his strange prayers. The Indian was gone.
"Confound him!" cried the doctor, stamping furiously. "Now I know that it was that nigger that did it."
"I thought you didn't believe in magic," said Father Brown quietly.
"No more I did," said the doctor, rolling his eyes. "I only know that I loathe that yellow devil when I thought he was a sham wizard, and I shall loathe him more if I come to think he was a real one." "Well, his having escaped is nothing," said Flambeau, "for we could have proved nothing and done nothing against him. One hardly goes to the parish constable with a story of suicide imposed by witchcraft or autosuggestion."
Meanwhile, Father Brown had made his way into the house, and now went to break the news to the wife of the dead man. When he came out again, he looked a little pale and tragic, but what passed between them in that interview was never known, even when all was known. Flambeau, who was talking quietly with the doctor, was surprised to see his friend reappear so soon at his elbow. But Brown took no notice, and merely drew the doctor apart. "You have sent for the police, haven't you?" he asked.
"Yes," answered Harris. "They ought to be here in 10 minutes.
"Will you do me a favour?" said the priest quietly. "The truth is, I make a collection of these curious stories, which often contain, as in the case of our Hindu friend, elements which can hardly be put into a police report. Now, I want you to write out a report of this case for my private use. Yours is a clever trade," he said, looking the doctor gravely and steadily in the face. "I sometimes think that you know some details of this matter which you have not thought fit to mention. Mine is a confidential trade, like yours, and I will treat anything you write for me in strict confidence. But write the whole." The doctor, who had been listening thoughtfully with his head a little on one side, looked the priest in the face for an instant and said, "All right," and went into the study, closing the door behind him. "Flambeau," said Father Brown, "there is a long seat there under the veranda where we can smoke out of the rain. You are my only friend in the world, and I want to talk to you, or perhaps be silent with you." They established themselves comfortably in the veranda seat. Father Brown, against his common habit, accepted a good cigar, and smoked it steadily in silence, while the rain shrieked and rattled on the roof of the veranda. "My friend," he said at length, "this is a very queer case. A very queer case."
"I should think it was," said Flambeau, with something like a shudder.
"You call it queer, and I call it queer," said the other, "and yet we mean quite opposite things. The modern mind always mixes up two different ideas. Mystery in the sense of what is marvellous, and mystery in the sense of what is complicated. That is half its difficulty about miracles. A miracle is startling, but it is simple. It is simple because it is a miracle. It is power coming directly from God, or the devil, instead of indirectly through nature or human wills. Now, you mean that this business is marvellous, because it is miraculous, because it is witchcraft worked by a wicked Indian. Understand, I do not say that it was not spiritual or diabolic. Heaven and hell only know by what surrounding influences strange sins come into the lives of men. But for the present, my point is this. If it was pure magic, as you think, then it is marvellous. But it is not mysterious. That is, it is not complicated. The quality of a miracle is mysterious, but its manner is simple. Now, the manner of this business has been the reverse of simple." The storm that had slackened for a little seemed to be swelling again, and there came heavy movements as of faint thunder. Father Brown let fall the ash of his cigar and went on. "There has been in this incident," he said, "a twisted, ugly, complex quality that does not belong to the straight bolts either of heaven or hell. As one knows the crooked track of a snail, I know the crooked track of a man." The white lightning opened its enormous eye in one wink, the sky shut up again, and the priest went on. "Of all these crooked things, the crookedest was the shape of that piece of paper. It was crookeder than the dagger that killed him."
"You mean the paper on which Quinton confessed his suicide?" said Flambeau.
"I mean the paper on which Quinton wrote, 'I die by my own hand,'" answered Father Brown. "The shape of that paper, my friend, was the wrong shape, if ever I have seen it in this wicked world."
"It only had a corner snipped off," said Flambeau, "and I understand that all Quinton's paper was cut that way."
"It was a very odd way," said the other, "and a very bad way, to my taste and fancy. Look here, Flambeau, this Quinton, God receive his soul, was perhaps a bit of a cur in some ways, but he really was an artist, with the pencil as well as the pen. His handwriting, though hard to read, was bold and beautiful. I can't prove what I say, I can't prove anything, but I tell you with the full force of conviction that he could never have cut that mean little piece off a sheet of paper. If he had wanted to cut down paper for some purpose of fitting in or binding up or what not, he would have made quite a different slash with the scissors. Do you remember the shape? It was a mean shape. It was a wrong shape. Like this. Don't you remember?" And he waved his burning cigar before him in the darkness, making irregular squares so rapidly that Flambeau really seemed to see them as fiery hieroglyphics upon the darkness, hieroglyphics such as his friend had spoken of, which are undecipherable, yet can have no good meaning.
"But," said Flambeau, as the priest put his cigar in his mouth again and leaned back, staring at the roof, "suppose somebody else did use the scissors. Why should somebody else, cutting pieces off his sermon paper, make Quinton commit suicide?"
Father Brown was still leaning back and staring at the roof, but he took his cigar out of his mouth and said, "Quinton never did commit suicide." Flambeau stared at him.
"Why, confound it all!" he cried. Then why did he confess to suicide?
The priest leaned forward again, settled his elbows on his knees, looked at the ground, and said in a low, distinct voice, "He never did confess to suicide." Flambeau laid his cigar down.
"You mean," he said, "that the writing was forged?"
"No," said Father Brown. "Quinton wrote it, all right."
"Well, there you are," said the aggravated Flambeau. "Quinton wrote, 'I die by my own hand,' with his own hand on a plain piece of paper."
"Of the wrong shape," said the priest calmly.
"Oh, the shape be damned!" cried Flambeau. "What has the shape to do with it?"
"There were 23 snipped papers," resumed Brown, unmoved, "and only 22 pieces snipped off. Therefore, one of the pieces had been destroyed, probably that from the written paper. Does that suggest anything to you?" A light dawned on Flambeau's face, and he said,
"There was something else written by Quinton? Some other words? They will tell you, 'I die by my own hand,' or 'Do not believe that—'"
"Hotter, as the children say," said his friend. "But the piece was hardly half an inch across. There was no room for one word, let alone 5. Can you think of anything hardly bigger than a comma, which the man with hell in his heart had to tear away as a testimony against him?"
"I can think of nothing," said Flambeau at last.
"What about quotation marks?" said the priest, and flung his cigar far into the darkness like a shooting star. All words had left the other man's mouth, and Father Brown said, like one going back to fundamentals, "Leonard Quinton was a romancer, and was writing an oriental romance about wizardry and hypnotism. He—" At this moment the door opened briskly behind them, and the doctor came out with his hat on. He put a long envelope into the priest's hands.
"That's the document you wanted," he said, "and I must be getting home. Good night."
"Good night," said Father Brown as the doctor walked briskly to the gate. He had left the front door open, so that a shaft of gaslight fell upon them. In the light of this, Brown opened the envelope and read the following words.
"Dear Father Brown, Vicisti Galilee. Otherwise, damn your eyes, which are very penetrating ones. Can it be possible that there is something in all that stuff of yours after all? I am a man who has ever since boyhood believed in nature, and in all natural functions and instincts, whether men call them moral or immoral. Long before I became a doctor, when I was a schoolboy keeping mice and spiders, I believed that to be a good animal is the best thing in the world. But just now, I am shaken. I have believed in nature, but it seems as if nature could betray a man. Can there be anything in your bosh? I'm really getting morbid. I loved Quinton's wife. What was there wrong in that? Nature told me to, and it's love that makes the world go round. I also thought quite sincerely that she would be happier with a clean animal like me than with that tormenting little lunatic. What was there wrong in that? I was only facing facts, like a man of science. She would have been happier. According to my own creed, I was quite free to kill Quinton, which was the best thing for everybody, even himself. But as a healthy animal, I had no notion of killing myself. I resolved, therefore, that I would never do it until I saw a chance that would leave me scot-free. I saw that chance this morning. I have been 3 times, all told, into Quinton's study today. The first time I went in, he would talk about nothing but the weird tale called The Cure of a Saint, which he was writing. which was all about how some Indian hermit made an English colonel kill himself by thinking about him. He showed me the last sheet and even read me the last paragraph, which was something like this: "The conqueror of the Punjab, a mere yellow skeleton, but still gigantic, managed to lift himself on his elbow and gasp in his nephew's ear, 'I die by my own hand, yet I die murdered.' It so happened, by one chance out of 100, that those last words were written at the top of a new sheet of paper. I left the room and went out into the garden intoxicated with a frightful opportunity. We walked round the house, and 2 more things happened in my favour. You suspected an Indian, and you found a dagger which the Indian might most probably use. Taking the opportunity to stuff it in my pocket, I went back to Quinton's study, locked the door, and gave him his sleeping draught. He was against answering Atkinson at all, but I urged him to call out and quiet the fellow, because I wanted a clear proof that Quinton was alive when I left the room for the second time. Quinton lay down in the conservatory, and I came through the study. I'm a quick man with my hands, and in a minute and a half I had done what I wanted to do. I'd emptied all the first part of Quinton's romance into the fireplace, where it burnt to ashes. Then I saw that the quotation marks wouldn't do, so I snipped them off, and to make it seem likelier, snipped the whole quire to match. Then I came out with the knowledge that Quinton's confession of suicide lay on the front table, while Quinton lay alive but asleep in the conservatory beyond. The last act was a desperate one. You can guess it. I pretended to have seen Quinton dead and rushed to his room. I delayed you with the paper, and, being a quick man with my hands, killed Quinton, while you were looking at his confession of suicide. He was half asleep, being drugged, and I put his own hand on the knife and drove it into his body. The knife was of so queer a shape that no one but an operator could have calculated the angle that would reach his heart. I wonder if you noticed this. When I had done it, the extraordinary thing happened. Nature deserted me. I felt ill. I felt just as if I had done something wrong. I think my brain is breaking up. I feel some sort of desperate pleasure in thinking I have told the thing to somebody, that I shall not have to be alone with it if I marry and have children. What is the matter with me? Madness? Or can one have remorse, just as if one were in Byron's poems? I cannot write any more. James Erskine Harris. Father Brown carefully folded up the letter and put it in his breast pocket, just as there came a loud peal at the gate bell, and the wet waterproofs of several policemen gleamed in the road outside. The Sins of Prince Saradine. When Flambeau took his month's holiday from his office in Westminster, he took it in a small sailing boat, so small that it passed much of its time as a rowing boat. He took it, moreover, in little rivers in the eastern counties, rivers so small that the boat looked like a magic boat, sailing on land through meadows and cornfields. The vessel was just comfortable for 2 people. There was room only for necessities, and Flambeau had stocked it with such things as his special philosophy considered necessary.
They reduced themselves, apparently, to 4 essentials: tins of salmon, if he should want to eat; loaded revolvers, if he should want to fight; a bottle of brandy, presumably in case he should faint; and a priest, presumably in case he should die. With this light luggage he crawled down the little Norfolk rivers, intending to reach the Broads at last, but meanwhile delighting in the overhanging gardens and meadows, the mirrored mansions or villages, lingering to fish in the pools and corners, and in some sense hugging the shore. Like a true philosopher, Flambeau had no aim in his holiday. But like a true philosopher, he had an excuse. He had a sort of half-purpose, which he took just so seriously that its success would crown the holiday, but just so lightly that its failure would not spoil it. Years ago, when he had been a king of thieves and the most famous figure in Paris, he had often received wild communications of approval, denunciation, or even love. But one had somehow stuck in his memory. It consisted simply of a visiting card, in an envelope with an English postmark. On the back of the card was written in French and in green ink, "If you ever retire and become respectable, come and see me. I want to meet you, for I have met all the other great men of my time. That trick of yours of getting one detective to arrest the other was the most splendid scene in French history." On the front of the card was engraved in the formal fashion, "Prince Saradine, Reed House, Reed Island, Norfolk." He had not troubled much about the prince then, beyond ascertaining that he had been a brilliant and fashionable figure in southern Italy. In his youth, it was said, he had eloped with a married woman of high rank. The escapade was scarcely startling in his social world, but it had clung to men's minds because of an additional tragedy: the alleged suicide of the insulted husband, who appeared to have flung himself over a precipice in Sicily. The prince then lived in Vienna for a time, but his more recent years seem to have been passed in perpetual and restless travel. But when Flambeau, like the prince himself, had left European celebrity and settled in England, it occurred to him that he might pay a surprise visit to this eminent exile in the Norfolk Broads. Whether he should find the place he had no idea, and indeed it was sufficiently small and forgotten. But as things fell out, he found it much sooner than he expected. They had moored their boat one night under a bank veiled in high grasses and short pollarded trees. Sleep, after heavy sculling, had come to them early, and by a corresponding accident they awoke before it was light. To speak more strictly, they awoke before it was daylight, for a large lemon moon was only just setting in the forest of high grass above their heads, and the sky was of a vivid violet blue, nocturnal but bright. Both men had simultaneously a reminiscence of childhood, of the elfin and adventurous time, when tall weeds close over us like woods. Standing up thus against the large low moon, the daisies really seemed to be giant daisies, the dandelions to be giant dandelions. Somehow it reminded them of the dado of a nursery wallpaper. The drop of the riverbed sufficed to sink them under the roots of all shrubs and flowers and make them gaze upwards at the grass. "By Jove," said Flambeau, "it's like being in fairyland." Father Brown sat bolt upright in the boat and crossed himself. His movement was so abrupt that his friend asked him, with a mild stare, what was the matter. "The people who wrote the medieval ballads," answered the priest, "knew more about fairies than you do. It isn't only nice things that happen in fairyland."
"Oh, bosh," said Flambeau. "Only nice things could happen under such an innocent moon. I am for pushing on now, and seeing what does really come. We may die and rot before we ever see again such a moon or such a mood."
"All right," said Father Brown. "I never said it was always wrong to enter fairyland. I only said it was always dangerous." They pushed slowly up the brightening river. The glowing violet of the sky and the pale gold of the moon grew fainter and fainter, and faded into that vast, colourless cosmos that precedes the colours of the dawn. When the first faint stripes of red and gold and grey split the horizon from end to end, they were broken by the black bulk of a town or village which sat on the river just ahead of them. It was already an easy twilight, in which all things were visible, when they came under the hanging roofs and bridges of this riverside hamlet. The houses, with their long, low, stooping roofs, seemed to come down to drink at the river, like huge grey and red cattle. The broadening and whitening dawn had already turned to working daylight before they saw any living creature on the wharves and bridges of that silent town. Eventually they saw a very placid and prosperous man in his shirt-sleeves, with a face as round as the recently sunken moon, and rays of red whisker around the low arc of it, who was leaning on a post above the sluggish tide. By an impulse not to be analysed, Flambeau rose to his full height in the swaying boat and shouted at the man to ask if he knew Reed Island or Reed House. The prosperous man's smile grew slightly more expansive, and he simply pointed up the river towards the next bend of it. Flambeau went ahead without further speech. The boat took many such grassy corners, and followed many such reedy and silent reaches of river, but before the search had become monotonous, they had swung round a specially sharp angle and come into the silence of a sort of pool or lake, the sight of which instinctively arrested them. For in the middle of this wider piece of water, fringed on every side with rushes, lay a long, low islet, along which ran a long, low house, or bungalow, built of bamboo or some kind of tough tropic cane. The upstanding rods of bamboo which made the walls were pale yellow. The sloping rods that made the roof were of darker red or brown. Otherwise the long house was a thing of repetition and monotony. The early morning breeze rustled the reeds round the island, and sang in the strange ribbed house, as in a giant panpipe.
"By George!" cried Flambeau. "Here is the place after all. Here is Reed Island, if ever there was one. Here is Reed House, if it is anywhere. I believe that fat man with whiskers was a fairy."
"Perhaps," remarked Father Brown impartially. "If he was a bad fairy." But even as he spoke, the impetuous Flambeau had run his boat ashore in the rattling reeds, and they stood in the long, quaint islet beside the odd and silent house. The house stood with its back, as it were, to the river, and the only landing stage. The main entrance was on the other side, and looked down the long island garden. The visitors approached it, therefore, by a small path running round nearly 3 sides of the house, close under the low eaves. Through 3 different windows, on 3 different sides, they looked in on the same long, well-lit room, panelled in light wood, with a large number of looking-glasses, and laid out as for an elegant lunch. The front door, when they came round to it at last, was flanked by 2 turquoise-blue flower-pots. It was opened by a butler of the drearier type, long, lean, grey, and listless, who murmured that Prince Saradine was from home at present, but was expected hourly, the house being kept ready for him and his guests. The exhibition of the card, with the scrawl of green ink, awoke a flicker of life in the parchment face of the depressed retainer, and it was with a certain shaky courtesy that he suggested that the strangers should remain. "His Highness may be here any minute," he said, "and would be distressed to have just missed any gentleman he had invited. We have orders always to keep a little cold lunch for him and his friends, and I am sure he would wish it to be offered." Moved with curiosity to this minor adventure, Flambeau assented gracefully, and followed the old man, who ushered him ceremoniously into the long, lightly panelled room. There was nothing very notable about it. except the rather unusual alternation of many long, low windows with many long, low oblongs of looking-glass, which gave a singular air of lightness and unsubstantialness to the place. It was somehow like lunching out of doors. One or two pictures of a quiet kind hung in the corners, one a large grey photograph of a very young man in uniform, another a red chalk sketch of two long-haired boys. Asked by Flambeau whether the soldierly person was the prince, the butler answered shortly in the negative. It was the prince's younger brother, Captain Stephen Saradine, he said. And with that the old man seemed to dry up suddenly and lose all taste for conversation. After lunch had tailed off with exquisite coffee and liqueurs, the guests were introduced to the garden, the library, and the housekeeper, a dark, handsome lady of no little majesty, and rather like a Plutonic Madonna. It appeared that she and the butler were the only survivors of the prince's original foreign ménage, the other servants now in the house being new and collected in Norfolk by the housekeeper. This latter lady went by the name of Mrs. Anthony, but she spoke with a slight Italian accent, and Flambeau did not doubt that Anthony was a Norfolk version of some more Latin name. Mr. Paul, the butler, also had a faintly foreign air, but he was in tongue and training English, as are many of the most polished men-servants of the cosmopolitan nobility. Pretty and unique as it was, the place had about it a curious, luminous sadness. Hours passed in it like days. The long, well-windowed rooms were full of daylight, but it seemed a dead daylight. And through all other incidental noises, the sound of talk, the clink of glasses, or the passing feet of servants, they could hear on all sides of the house the melancholy noise of the river. "We have taken a wrong turning and come to a wrong place," said Father Brown, looking out of the window at the grey-green sedges and the silver flood. "Never mind. One can sometimes do good by being the right person in the wrong place." Father Brown, though commonly a silent, was an oddly sympathetic little man, and in those few but endless hours he unconsciously sank deeper into the secrets of Reed House than his professional friend. He had that knack of friendly silence, which is so essential to gossip. And, saying scarcely a word, he probably obtained from his new acquaintances all that in any case they would have told. The butler, indeed, was naturally uncommunicative. He betrayed a sullen and almost animal affection for his master, who, he said, had been very badly treated. The chief offender seemed to be His Highness's brother, whose name alone would lengthen the old man's lantern jaws and pucker his parrot nose into a sneer. Captain Stephen was a ne'er-do-well, apparently, and had drained his benevolent brother of hundreds and thousands, forced him to fly from fashionable life and live quietly in this retreat. That was all Paul the butler would say. And Paul was obviously a partisan. Prince Saradine distributed his social attentions between his guests with great gaiety and tact. Finding the detective of a sporting turn and eager to employ his holiday, he guided Flambeau and Flambeau's boat down to the best fishing spot in the stream, and was back in his own canoe in 20 minutes to join Father Brown in the library, and plunge equally politely into the priest's more philosophic pleasures. He seemed to know a great deal both about the fishing and the books, though of these not the most edifying. He spoke 5 or 6 languages, though chiefly the slang of each. He had evidently lived in varied cities and very motley societies, for some of his cheerfulest stories were about gambling hells and opium dens, Australian bushrangers or Italian brigands. Father Brown knew that the once celebrated Saradine had spent his last few years in almost ceaseless travel, but he had not guessed that the travels were so disreputable or so amusing. Indeed, with all his dignity of a man of the world, Prince Saradine radiated to such sensitive observers as the priest a certain atmosphere of the restless, and even the unreliable. His face was fastidious, but his eye was wild. He had little nervous tricks, like a man shaken by drink or drugs, and he neither had, nor professed to have, his hand on the helm of household affairs. All these were left to the two old servants, especially to the butler, who was plainly the central pillar of the house. Mr. Paul, indeed, was not so much a butler as a sort of steward, or even chamberlain. He dined privately, but with almost as much pomp as his master. He was feared by all the servants, and he consulted with the prince decorously, but somewhat unbendingly, rather as if he were the prince's solicitor. The sombre housekeeper was a mere shadow in comparison. Indeed, she seemed to efface herself and wait only on the butler. And Brown heard no more of those volcanic whispers which had half told him of the younger brother who blackmailed the elder. Whether the prince was really being thus bled by the absent captain, he could not be certain, but there was something insecure and secretive about Saradine that made the tale by no means incredible. When they went once more into the long hall with the windows and the mirrors, yellow evening was dropping over the waters and the willowy banks, and a bittern sounded in the distance like an elf upon his dwarfish drum. The same singular sentiment of some sad and evil fairyland crossed the priest's mind again like a little grey cloud. "I wish Flambeau were back," he muttered. "Do you believe in doom?" asked the restless Prince Saradine suddenly. "No," answered his guest. "I believe in doomsday." The prince turned from the window and stared at him in a singular manner, his face in shadow against the sunset. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean that we here are on the wrong side of the tapestry," answered Father Brown. "The things that happen here do not seem to mean anything. They mean something somewhere else. Somewhere else retribution will come on the real offender. Here it often seems to fall on the wrong person." The prince made an inexplicable noise like an animal. In his shadowed face the eyes were shining queerly. A new and shrewd thought exploded silently in the other's mind. Was there another meaning in Saradine's blend of brilliancy and abruptness? Was the prince... was he perfectly sane? He was repeating, "The wrong person, the wrong person," many more times than was natural in a social exclamation. Then Father Brown awoke tardily to a second truth. In the mirrors before him he could see the silent door standing open, and the silent Mr. Paul standing in it, with his usual pallid impassiveness. "I thought it better to announce at once," he said, with the same stiff respectfulness as of an old family lawyer. "A boat, rowed by 6 men, has come to the landing stage, and there's a gentleman sitting in the stern." "A boat?" repeated the prince. "A gentleman?" And he rose to his feet. There was a startled silence, punctuated only by the odd noise of the bird in the sedge. And then, before anyone could speak again, a new face and figure passed in profile round the 3 sunlit windows, as the prince had passed an hour or 2 before. But, except for the accident that both outlines were aquiline, they had little in common. Instead of the new white topper of Saradine was a black one of antiquated or foreign shape. Under it was a young and very solemn face, clean-shaven, blue about its resolute chin, and carrying a faint suggestion of the young Napoleon. The association was assisted by something old and odd about the whole get-up, as of a man who had never troubled to change the fashions of his fathers. He had a shabby blue frock-coat, a red soldierly-looking waistcoat, and a kind of coarse white trousers common among the early Victorians, but strangely incongruous today. From all this old clothes shop, his olive face stood out strangely young and monstrously sincere. "The deuce!" said Prince Saradine, and clapping on his white hat, he went to the front door himself, flinging it open on the sunset garden. By that time, the newcomer and his followers were drawn up on the lawn like a small stage army. The 6 boatmen had pulled the boat well up on shore and were guarding it almost menacingly, holding their oars erect like spears. They were swarthy men, and some of them wore earrings. But one of them stood forward beside the olive-faced young man in the red waistcoat and carried a large black case of unfamiliar form. "Your name," said the young man, "is Saradine?" Saradine assented rather negligently. The newcomer had dull, dog-like brown eyes, as different as possible from the restless and glittering grey eyes of the prince. But once again Father Brown was tortured with a sense of having seen somewhere a replica of the face. And once again he remembered the repetitions of the glass-panelled room, and put down the coincidence to that. "Confound this Crystal Palace," he muttered. "One sees everything too many times. It's like a dream." "If you are Prince Saradine," said the young man, "I may tell you that my name is Antonelli." "Antonelli?" repeated the prince languidly. "Somehow I remember the name." "Permit me to present myself," said the young Italian. With his left hand he politely took off his old-fashioned top hat. With his right he caught Prince Saradine so ringing a crack across the face that the white top hat rolled down the steps and one of the blue flower-pots rocked upon its pedestal. The prince, whatever he was evidently not a coward. He sprang at his enemy's throat and almost bore him backwards to the grass, but his enemy extricated himself with a singularly inappropriate air of hurried politeness. "That is all right," he said, panting and in halting English. "I have insulted. I will give satisfaction. Marco, open the case." The man beside him with the earrings and the big black case proceeded to unlock it. He took out of it 2 long Italian rapiers, with splendid steel hilts and blades, which he planted point downwards in the lawn. The strange young man standing facing the entrance with his yellow and vindictive face, the 2 swords standing up in the turf like 2 crosses in a cemetery, and the line of the ranked rowers behind, gave it all an odd appearance of being some barbaric court of justice. But everything else was unchanged, so sudden had been the interruption. The sunset gold still glowed on the lawn, and the bittern still boomed, as announcing some small but dreadful destiny. "Prince Saradine," said the man called Antonelli, "when I was an infant in the cradle, you killed my father and stole my mother. My father was the more fortunate. You did not kill him fairly, as I am going to kill you. You and my wicked mother took him driving to a lonely pass in Sicily, flung him down a cliff, and went on your way. I could imitate you if I chose, but imitating you is too vile. I have followed you all over the world, and you have always fled from me. But this is the end of the world, and of you. I have you now, and I give you the chance you never gave my father. Choose one of those swords." Prince Saradine, with contracted brows, seemed to hesitate a moment, but his ears were still singing with the blow, and he sprang forward and snatched at one of the hilts. Father Brown had also sprung forward, striving to compose the dispute, but he soon found his personal presence made matters worse. Saradine was a French Freemason and a fierce atheist, and a priest moved him by the law of contraries. And for the other man, neither priest nor layman moved him at all. This young man with the Bonaparte face and the brown eyes was something far sterner than a Puritan, a pagan. He was a simple slayer from the morning of the earth, a man of the Stone Age, a man of stone. One hope remained, the summoning of the household, and Father Brown ran back into the house. He found, however, that all the under-servants had been given a holiday ashore by the autocrat Paul, and that only the sombre Mrs. Anthony moved uneasily about the long rooms. But the moment she turned a ghastly face upon him, he resolved one of the riddles of the House of Mirrors. The heavy brown eyes of Antonelli were the heavy brown eyes of Mrs. Anthony, and in a flash he saw half the story. "Your son is outside," he said, without wasting words. "Either he or the prince will be killed. Where is Mr. Paul?" "He is at the landing stage," said the woman faintly. He is signalling for help." "Mrs. Anthony," said Father Brown seriously, "there is no time for nonsense. My friend has his boat down the river fishing. Your son's boat is guarded by your son's men. There is only this one canoe. What is Mr. Paul doing with it?" "Santa Maria, I do not know," she said, and swooned all her length on the matted floor. Father Brown lifted her to a sofa, flung a pot of water over her, shouted for help, and then rushed down to the landing stage of the little island. But the canoe was already in midstream, and old Paul was pulling and pushing it up the river with an energy incredible at his years. The Eye of Apollo. That singular smoky sparkle, at once a confusion and a transparency, which is the strange secret of the Thames, was changing more and more from its grey to its glittering extreme as the sun climbed to the zenith over Westminster, and two men crossed Westminster Bridge. One man was very tall, and the other very short. They might even have been fantastically compared to the arrogant clock tower of Parliament and the humbler humped shoulders of the Abbey, for the short man was in clerical dress. The official description of the tall man was Monsieur Hercule Flambeau, private detective, and he was going to his new offices in a new pile of flats facing the Abbey entrance. The official description of the short man was the Reverend J. Brown, attached to St. Francis Xavier's Church, Camberwell, and he was coming from a Camberwell deathbed to see the new offices of his friend. The building was American in its sky-scraping altitude, and American also in the oiled elaboration of its machinery, of telephones and lifts. But it was barely finished, and still understaffed. Only 3 tenants had moved in. The office just above Flambeau was occupied, as also was the office just below him. The 2 floors above that and the 3 floors below were entirely bare. But the first glance at the new tower of flats caught something much more arresting. Save for a few relics of scaffolding, the one glaring object was erected outside the office just above Flambeau's. It was an enormous gilt effigy of the human eye, surrounded with rays of gold, and taking up as much room as 2 or 3 of the office windows. "What on earth is that?" asked Father Brown, and stood still.
"Oh, a new religion," said Flambeau, laughing. "One of those new religions that forgive your sins by saying you never had any. Rather like Christian Science, I should think. The fact is that a fellow calling himself Kalon, I don't know what his name is, except that it can't be that, has taken the flat just above me. I have 2 lady typewriters underneath me, and this enthusiastic old humbug on top. He calls himself the new priest of Apollo, and he worships the sun."
"Let him look out," said Father Brown. "The sun was the cruellest of all the gods. But what does that monstrous eye mean?"
"As I understand it, it is a theory of theirs," answered Flambeau, "that a man can endure anything if his mind is quite steady. Their two great symbols are the sun and the open eye, for they say that if a man were really healthy, he could stare at the sun."
"If a man were really healthy," said Father Brown, "he would not bother to stare at it."
"Well, that's all I can tell you about the new religion," went on Flambeau carelessly. "It claims, of course, that it can cure all physical diseases."
"Can it cure the one spiritual disease?" asked Father Brown with a serious curiosity.
"And what is the one spiritual disease?" asked Flambeau, smiling.
"Oh, thinking one is quite well," said his friend. Flambeau was more interested in the quiet little office below him than in the flamboyant temple above. He was a lucid southerner, incapable of conceiving himself as anything but a Catholic or an atheist, and new religions of a bright and pallid sort were not much in his line. But humanity was always in his line, especially when it was good-looking. Moreover, the ladies downstairs were characters in their way. The office was kept by two sisters, both slight and dark, one of them tall and striking. She had a dark, eager, and aquiline profile, and was one of those women whom one always thinks of in profile, as of the clean-cut edge of some weapon. She seemed to cleave her way through life. She had eyes of startling brilliancy, but it was the brilliancy of steel rather than of diamonds, and her straight, slim figure was a shade too stiff for its grace. Her younger sister was like her shortened shadow, a little greyer, paler, and more insignificant. They both wore a business-like black, with little masculine cuffs and collars. There are thousands of such curt, strenuous ladies in the offices of London, but the interest of these lay rather in their real than their apparent position. For Pauline Stacey, the elder, was actually the heiress of a crest, and half a county, as well as great wealth. She had been brought up in castles and gardens before a frigid fierceness, peculiar to the modern woman, had driven her to what she considered a harsher and a higher existence. She had not, indeed, surrendered her money. In that there would have been a romantic or monkish abandon, quite alien to her masterful utilitarianism. She held her wealth, she would say, for use upon practical social objects. Part of it she had put into her business, the nucleus of a model typewriting emporium. Part of it was distributed in various leagues and causes for the advancement of such work among women. How far Joan, her sister and partner, shared this slightly prosaic idealism, no one could be very sure. But she followed her leader with a dog-like affection, which was somehow more attractive, with its touch of tragedy, than the hard, high spirits of the elder. For Pauline Stacey had nothing to say to tragedy. She was understood to deny its existence. Her rigid rapidity and cold impatience had amused Flambeau very much on the first occasion of his entering the flats. He had lingered outside the lift in the entrance hall, waiting for the lift boy, who generally conducts strangers to the various floors. But this bright-eyed falcon of a girl had openly refused to endure such official delay. She said sharply that she knew all about the lift, and was not dependent on boys or men either. Though her flat was only 3 floors above, she managed, in the few seconds of ascent, to give Flambeau a great many of her fundamental views in an off-hand manner. They were to the general effect that she was a modern working woman and loved modern working machinery. Her bright black eyes blazed with abstract anger against those who rebuke mechanic science and ask for the return of romance. Everyone, she said, ought to be able to manage machines, just as she could manage the lift. She seemed almost to resent the fact of Flambeau opening the lift door for her, and that gentleman went up to his own apartments, smiling with somewhat mingled feelings at the memory of such spitfire self-dependence. But all these levities are scattered by what may well be called the note of a bugle. Behind the English camp, and almost parallel to the river, ran one of the few great roads of that district. Westward, the road curved round towards the river, which it crossed by the bridge before mentioned. To the east, the road swept backwards into the wilds, and some 2 miles along it was the next English outpost. From this direction there came along the road that evening a glitter and clatter of light cavalry, in which even the simple diarist could recognize with astonishment the general with his staff. He rode the great white horse which you have seen so often in illustrated papers and academy pictures, and you may be sure that the salute they gave him was not merely ceremonial. He, at least, wasted no time on ceremony, but springing from the saddle immediately, mixed with the group of officers, and fell into emphatic, though confidential, speech. What struck our friend the diarist most was his special disposition to discuss matters with Major Murray. But, indeed, such a selection, so long as it was not marked, was in no way unnatural. The two men were made for sympathy. They were men who read their Bibles. They were both the old evangelical type of officer. However this may be, it is certain that when the general mounted again, he was still talking earnestly to Murray, and that as he walked his horse slowly down the road towards the river, the tall Ulsterman still walked by his bridle rein, in earnest debate. The soldiers watched the two until they vanished behind a clump of trees, where the road turned towards the river. The colonel had gone back to his tent, and the men to their pickets. The man with the diary lingered for another 4 minutes, and saw a marvellous sight. The great white horse, which had marched slowly down the road, as it had marched in so many processions, flew back, galloping up the road towards them as if it were mad to win a race. At first they thought it had run away with the man on its back, but they soon saw that the general, a fine rider, was himself urging it to full speed. Horse and man swept up to them like a whirlwind, and then, reining up the reeling charger, the general turned on them a face like flame, and called for the colonel like the trumpet that wakes the dead. I conceive that all the earthquake events of that catastrophe tumbled on top of each other rather like lumber in the minds of men such as our friend with the diary. With the dazed excitement of a dream, they found themselves falling, literally falling, into their ranks, and learned that an attack was to be led at once across the river. The general and the major, it was said, had found out something at the bridge, and there was only just time to strike for life. The major had gone back at once to call up the reserve along the road behind. It was doubtful if, even with that prompt appeal, help could reach them in time. But they must pass the stream that night, and seize the heights by morning. It is with the very stir and throb of that romantic nocturnal march that the diary suddenly ends. Father Brown had mounted ahead, for the woodland path grew smaller, steeper, and more twisted, till they felt as if they were ascending a winding staircase. The priest's voice came from above, out of the darkness. There was one other little and enormous thing. When the general urged them to their chivalric charge, he half drew his sword from the scabbard, and then, as if ashamed of such melodrama, thrust it back again. The sword again, you see? A half-light broke through the network of boughs above them, flinging the ghost of a net about their feet, for they were mounting again to the faint luminosity of the naked night. Flambeau felt truth all round him as an atmosphere, but not as an idea. He answered with bewildered brain, "Well, what's the matter with the sword? Officers generally have swords, don't they?"
"They are not often mentioned in modern war," said the other dispassionately. "But in this affair one falls over the blessed sword everywhere."
"Well, what is there in that?" growled Flambeau. "It was a tuppence-coloured sort of incident, the old man's blade breaking in his last battle. Anyone might bet the papers would get hold of it, as they have. On all these tombs and things, it's shown broken at the point. I hope you haven't dragged me through this polar expedition merely because two men with an eye for a picture saw St. Clair's broken sword."
"No," cried Father Brown, with a sharp voice like a pistol shot. "But who saw his unbroken sword?"
"What do you mean?"
cried the other, and stood still under the stars. They had come abruptly out of the grey gates of the wood. "I say, who saw his unbroken sword?" repeated Father Brown obstinately. "Not the writer of the diary, anyhow. The General sheathed it in time." Flambeau looked about him in the moonlight, as a man struck blind might look in the sun, and his friend went on, for the first time with eagerness. "Flambeau," he cried, "I cannot prove it, even after hunting through the tombs, but I am sure of it. Let me add just one more tiny fact that tips the whole thing over. The colonel, by a strange chance, was one of the first struck by a bullet. He was struck long before the troops came to close quarters, but he saw St. Clair's sword broken. Why was it broken? How was it broken? My friend, it was broken before the battle."
"Oh," said his friend with a sort of forlorn jocularity, "and pray, where is the other piece?"
"I can tell you," said the priest promptly. "In the northeast corner of the cemetery of the Protestant cathedral at Belfast."
"Indeed?" inquired the other. "Have you looked for it?"
"I couldn't," replied Brown with frank regret. "There's a great marble monument on top of it, a monument to the heroic Major Murray, who fell fighting gloriously at the famous Battle of the Black River." Flambeau seemed suddenly galvanized into existence.
"You mean," he cried hoarsely, "that General St. Clair hated Murray and murdered him on the field of battle because—"
"You are still full of good and pure thoughts," said the other. "It was worse than that."
"Well," said the large man, "my stock of evil imagination is used up."
The priest seemed really doubtful where to begin, and at last he said again, "Where would a wise man hide a leaf? In the forest." The other did not answer. If there were no forest, he would make a forest, and if he wished to hide a dead leaf, he would make a dead forest. There was still no reply, and the priest added still more mildly and quietly, "And if a man had to hide a dead body, he would make a field of dead bodies to hide it in." Flambeau began to stamp forward with an intolerance of delay in time or space, but Father Brown went on, as if he were continuing the last sentence. "Sir Arthur St. Clair, as I have already said, was a man who read his Bible. That was what was the matter with him. When will people understand that it is useless for a man to read his Bible unless he also reads everybody else's Bible? A printer reads a Bible for misprints. A Mormon reads his Bible and finds polygamy. A Christian Scientist reads his and finds we have no arms and legs. St. Clair was an old Anglo-Indian Protestant soldier. Now just think what that might mean. And for heaven's sake don't cant about it. It might mean a man physically formidable living under a tropic sun in an Oriental society and soaking himself without sense or guidance in an Oriental book. Of course he read the Old Testament rather than the New. Of course he found in the Old Testament anything that he wanted. Lust, tyranny, treason,
Oh, I dare say he was honest, as you call it, but what is the good of a man being honest in his worship of dishonesty? In each of the hot and secret countries to which the man went, he kept a harem. He tortured witnesses. He amassed shameful gold. But certainly he would have said with steady eyes that he did it to the glory of the Lord. My own theology is sufficiently expressed by asking, which Lord? Anyhow, there is this about such evil, that it opens door after door in hell, and always into smaller and smaller chambers. This is the real case against crime, that a man does not become wilder and wilder, but only meaner and meaner. St. Clair was soon suffocated by difficulties of bribery and blackmail, and needed more and more cash. And by the time of the Battle of the Black River, he had fallen from world to that place which Dante makes the lowest floor of the universe.
"What do you mean?" asked his friend again.
"I mean that," retorted the cleric, and suddenly pointed at a puddle sealed with ice that shone in the moon. "Do you remember whom Dante put in the last circle of ice?"
"The traitors," said Flambeau, and shuddered.
As he looked around at the inhuman landscape of trees, with taunting and almost obscene outlines, he could almost fancy he was Dante, and the priest with the rivulet of a voice was, indeed, a Virgil leading him through a land of eternal sins. The voice went on. "Olivier, as you know, was quixotic, and would not permit a secret service and spies. The thing, however, was done, like many other things, behind his back. It was managed by my old friend Espado. He was the bright-clad fop whose hook nose got him called the Vulture. Posing as a sort of philanthropist at the front, he felt his way through the English army, and at last got his fingers on its one corrupt man, please God, and that man at the top. St. Clair was in foul need of money, and mountains of it. The discredited family doctor was threatening those extraordinary exposures that afterwards began and were broken off. Tales of monstrous and prehistoric things in Park Lane, things done by an English evangelist that smelt like human sacrifice and hordes of slaves. Money was wanted, too, for his daughter's dowry, for to him the fame of wealth was as sweet as wealth itself. He snapped the last thread, whispered the word to Brazil, and wealth poured in from the enemies of England. But another man had talked to Espado the Vulture as well as he. Somehow the dark, grim young major from Ulster had guessed the hideous truth, and when they walked slowly together down that road towards the bridge, Murray was telling the general that he must resign instantly or be court-martialed and shot. The general temporized with him till they came to the fringe of tropic trees by the bridge. And there, by the singing river and the sunlit palms, for I can see the picture, the general drew his sabre and plunged it through the body of the major. The wintry road curved over a ridge in cutting frost, with cruel black shapes of bush and thicket. But Flambeau fancied that he saw beyond it, faintly, the edge of an aureole that was not starlight and moonlight, but some fire such as is made by men. He watched it as the tale drew to its close. St. Clair was a hell-hound, but he was a hound of breed. Never, I'll swear, was he so lucid and so strong as when poor Murray lay a cold lump at his feet. Never in all his triumphs, as Captain Keith said truly, was the great man so great as he was in this last world-despised defeat. He looked coolly at his weapon to wipe off the blood. He saw the point he had planted between his victim's shoulders had broken off in the body. He saw, quite calmly, as through a club window-pane, all that must follow. He saw that men must find the unaccountable corpse, must extract the unaccountable sword-point, must notice the unaccountable broken sword or absence of sword. He had killed, but not silenced. But his imperious intellect rose against the facer. There was one way yet. He could make the corpse less unaccountable. He could create a hill of corpses to cover this one. In 20 minutes, 800 English soldiers were marching down to their death. The warmer glow behind the black winter wood grew richer and brighter, and Flambeau strode on to reach it. Father Brown also quickened his stride, but he seemed merely absorbed in his tale. Such was the valour of that English 1,000, and such the genius of their commander, that if they had at once attacked the hill, even their mad march might have met some luck. But the evil mind that played with them like pawns had other aims and reasons. They must remain in the marshes by the bridge, at least till British corpses should be a common sight there. Then, for the last grand scene, the silver-haired soldier saint would give up his shattered sword to save further slaughter. Oh, it was well organized for an impromptu. But I cannot prove, I think that it was while they stuck there in the bloody mire that someone doubted, and someone guessed. He was mute a moment, and then said, "There is a voice from nowhere that tells me the man who guessed was the lover, the man to wed the old man's child."
"But what about Olivier and the hanging?" asked Flambeau.
Olivier, partly from chivalry, partly from policy, seldom encumbered his march with captives, explained the narrator. He released everybody in most cases. He released everybody in this case.
"Everybody but the general," said the tall man.
"Everybody," said the priest. Flambeau knit his black brows.
"I don't grasp it all yet," he said.
"There is another picture, Flambeau," said Brown in his more mystical undertone. "I can't prove it, but I can do more. I can see it. There is a camp breaking up on the bare torrid hills at morning, and Brazilian uniforms massed in blocks and columns to march. There is the red shirt and long black beard of Olivier, which blows as he stands, his broad-brimmed hat in his hand. He is saying farewell to the great enemy he is setting free, the simple, snow-headed English veteran, who thanks him in the name of his men. The English remnant stand behind, at attention. Beside them are stores and vehicles for the retreat. The drums roll. The Brazilians are moving, the English are still like statues. So they abide, till the last hum and flash of the enemy have faded from the tropic horizon. Then they alter their postures all at once, like dead men coming to life. They turn their 50 faces upon the general. Faces not to be forgotten. Flambeau gave a great jump. "Ah!" he cried. "You don't mean—" "Yes," said Father Brown in a deep, moving voice. "It was an English hand that put the rope round St. Clair's neck. I believe the hand that put the ring on his daughter's finger. They were English hands that dragged him up to the tree of shame, the hands of men that had adored him and followed him to victory, and they were English souls, God pardon and endure us all, who stared at him, swinging in that foreign sun on the green gallows of palm, and prayed in their hatred that he might drop off it into hell. As the two topped the ridge, there burst on them the strong scarlet light of a red-curtained English inn. It stood sideways in the road, as if standing aside in the amplitude of hospitality. Its 3 doors stood open with invitation, and even where they stood they could hear the hum and laughter of humanity, happy for a night. "I need not tell you more," said Father Brown. "They tried him in the wilderness and destroyed him. And then, for the honour of England and of his daughter, they took an oath to seal up for ever the story of the traitor's purse and the assassin's sword-blade. Perhaps, heaven help them, they tried to forget it. Let us try to forget it anyhow. Here is our inn." "With all my heart," said Flambeau, and was just striding into the bright, noisy bar when he stepped back and almost fell on the road. "Look there! In the devil's name!" he cried, and pointed rigidly at the square wooden sign that overhung the road. It showed dimly the crude shape of a sabre hilt and a shortened blade, and was inscribed in false archaic lettering, "The Sign of the Broken Sword." "Were you not prepared?" asked Father Brown gently. "He is the god of this country. Half the inns and parks and streets are named after him and his story." "I thought we had done with the leper," cried Flambeau, and spat on the road. "You will never have done with him in England," said the priest, looking down, "while brass is strong and stone abides. His marble statues will erect the souls of proud, innocent boys for centuries. His village tomb will smell of loyalty as of lilies. Millions who never knew him shall love him like a father. This man whom the last few that knew him dealt with like dung. He shall be a saint, and the truth shall never be told of him, because I have made up my mind at last. There is so much good and evil in breaking secrets that I put my conduct to a test. All these newspapers will perish. The anti-Brazil boom is already over. Olivier is already honoured everywhere. But I told myself that if anywhere, by name, in metal or marble, that will endure like the pyramids, Colonel Clancy or Captain Keith or President Olivier or any innocent man was wrongly blamed, then I would speak. If it were only that St. Clair was wrongly praised, I would be silent. And I will. They plunged into the red-curtained tavern, which was not only cosy, but even luxurious inside. On a table stood a silver model of the tomb of St. Clair, the silver head bowed, the silver sword broken. On the walls were coloured photographs of the same scene, and of the system of wagonettes that took tourists to see it. They sat down on the comfortable padded benches. "Come, it's cold," cried Father Brown. "Let's have some wine or beer." "Or brandy," said Flambeau. The Three Tools of Death. Both by calling and conviction, Father Brown knew better than most of us that every man is dignified when he is dead. But even he felt a pang of incongruity when he was knocked up at daybreak and told that Sir Aaron Armstrong had been murdered. There was something absurd and unseemly about secret violence in connection with so entirely entertaining and popular a figure. For Sir Aaron Armstrong was entertaining to the point of being comic, and popular in such a manner as to be almost legendary. It was like hearing that Sonny Jim had hanged himself, or that Mr. Pickwick had died in Hanwell. For though Sir Aaron was a philanthropist, and thus dealt with the darker side of our society, he prided himself on dealing with it in the brightest possible style. His political and social speeches were cataracts of anecdotes and loud laughter. His bodily health was of a bursting sort. His ethics were all optimism, and he dealt with the drink problem, his favourite topic, with that immortal or even monotonous gaiety which is so often a mark of the prosperous total abstainer. The established story of his conversion was familiar on the more puritanic platforms and pulpits, how he had been, when only a boy, drawn away from Scotch theology to Scotch whisky, and how he had risen out of both, and become, as he modestly put it, what he was. Yet his wide white beard, cherubic face, and sparkling spectacles at the numberless dinners and congresses where they appeared made it hard to believe, somehow, that he had ever been anything so morbid as either a dram drinker or a Calvinist. He was, one felt, the most seriously merry of all the sons of men. He had lived on the rural skirt of Hampstead, in a handsome house, high but not broad, a modern and prosaic tower. The narrowest of its narrow sides overhung the steep green bank of a railway, and was shaken by passing trains. Sir Aaron Armstrong, as he boisterously explained, had no nerves. But if the train had often given a shock to the house, that morning the tables were turned, and it was the house that gave a shock to the train. The engine slowed down and stopped just beyond that point where an angle of the house impinged upon the sharp slope of turf. The arrest of most mechanical things must be slow, but the living cause of this had been very rapid. A man, clad completely in black, even, it was remembered, to the dreadful detail of black gloves, appeared on the ridge above the engine and waved his black hands like some sable windmill. This in itself would hardly have stopped even a lingering train, but there came out of him a cry which was talked of afterwards as something utterly unnatural and new. It was one of those shouts that are horridly distinct, even when we cannot hear what is shouted. The word in this case was murder. But the engine-driver swears he would have pulled up just the same if he had heard only the dreadful and definite accent, and not the word. The train, once arrested, the most superficial stare could take in many features of the tragedy. The man in black on the green bank was Sir Aaron Armstrong's manservant, Magnus. The baronet, in his optimism, had often laughed at the black gloves of this dismal attendant, but no one was likely to laugh at him just now. So soon as an inquirer or two had stepped off the line and across the smoky hedge, they saw, rolled down almost to the bottom of the bank, the body of an old man in a yellow dressing-gown with a very vivid scarlet lining. A scrap of rope seemed caught about his leg, entangled presumably in a struggle. There was a smear or so of blood, though very little, but the body was bent or broken into a posture impossible to any living thing. It was Sir Aaron Armstrong. A few more bewildered moments brought out a big, fair-bearded man, whom some travellers could salute as the dead man's secretary, Patrick Royce, once well known in Bohemian society, and even famous in the Bohemian arts. In a manner more vague, but even more convincing, he echoed the agony of the servant. By the time the third figure of that household, Alice Armstrong, daughter of the dead man, had come already tottering and waving into the garden, the engine-driver had put a stop to his stoppage. The whistle had blown, and the train had panted on to get help from the next station. Father Brown had been thus rapidly summoned at the request of Patrick Royce, the big ex-Bohemian secretary. Royce was an Irishman by birth, and that casual kind of Catholic that never remembers his religion until he is really in a hole. But Royce's request might have been less promptly complied with if one of the official detectives had not been a friend and admirer of the unofficial Flambeau. And it was impossible to be a friend of Flambeau without hearing numberless stories about Father Brown. Hence, while the young detective, whose name was Merton, led the little priest across the fields to the railway, their talk was more confidential than could be expected between two total strangers. "As far as I can see," said Mr. Merton candidly, "there is no sense to be made of it at all. There is nobody one can suspect. Magnus is a solemn old fool, far too much of a fool to be an assassin. Royce has been the baronet's best friend for years, and his daughter undoubtedly adored him. Besides, it's all too absurd. Who would kill such a cheery old chap as Armstrong? Who could dip his hands in the gore of an after-dinner speaker? It would be like killing Father Christmas." "Yes, it was a cheery house," assented Father Brown. "It was a cheery house while he was alive. Do you think it will be cheery now he is dead?" Merton started a little and regarded his companion with an enlivened eye. "Now he is dead?" he repeated. "Yes," continued the priest stolidly. "He was cheerful, but did he communicate his cheerfulness? Frankly, was anyone else in the house cheerful but he?" A window in Merton's mind let in that strange light of surprise in which we see, for the first time, things we have known all along. He had often been to the Armstrongs on little police jobs of the philanthropist, and now he came to think of it, it was in itself a depressing house. The rooms were very high and very cold, the decoration mean and provincial. The draughty corridors were lit by electricity that was bleaker than moonlight, and though the old man's scarlet face and silver beard had blazed like a bonfire in each room or passage in turn, it did not leave any warmth behind it. Doubtless this spectral discomfort in the place was partly due to the very vitality and exuberance of its owner. He needed no stoves or lamps, he would say, but carried his own warmth with him. But when Merton recalled the other inmates, he was compelled to confess that they also were as shadows of their lord. The moody manservant, with his monstrous black gloves, was almost a nightmare. Royce, the secretary, was solid enough, a big bull of a man in tweeds, with a short beard, but the straw-coloured beard was startlingly salted with grey, like the tweeds, and the broad forehead was barred with premature wrinkles. He was good-natured enough also, but it was a sad sort of good-nature, almost a heart-broken sort. He had the general air of being some sort of failure in life. As for Armstrong's daughter, it was almost incredible that she was his daughter. She was so pallid in colour and sensitive in outline. She was graceful, but there was a quiver in the very shape of her that was like the lines of an aspen. Merton had sometimes wondered if she had learnt to quail at the crash of the passing trains. "You see," said Father Brown, blinking modestly, "I'm not sure that the Armstrong cheerfulness is so very cheerful for other people. You say that nobody could kill such a happy old man, but I'm not sure. Ne nos inducas in tentationem. If ever I murdered somebody," he added quite simply, "I dare say it might be an optimist." "Why?" cried Merton, amused. "Do you think people dislike cheerfulness?" "People like frequent laughter," answered Father Brown, "but I don't think they like a permanent smile." Cheerfulness without humour is a very trying thing. They walked some way in silence along the windy, grassy bank by the rail, and just as they came under the far-flung shadow of the tall Armstrong house, Father Brown said suddenly, like a man throwing away a troublesome thought rather than offering it seriously, "Of course, drink is neither good nor bad in itself, but I can't help sometimes feeling that men like Armstrong want an occasional glass of wine to sadden them." Merton's official superior, a grizzled and capable detective named Gilder, was standing on the green bank waiting for the coroner, talking to Patrick Royce, whose big shoulders and bristly beard and hair towered above him. This was the more noticeable because Royce walked always with a sort of powerful stoop, and seemed to be going about his small clerical and domestic duties in a heavy and humbled style, like a buffalo drawing a go-cart. He raised his head with unusual pleasure at the sight of the priest, and took him a few paces apart. Meanwhile, Merton was addressing the older detective, respectfully indeed, but not without a certain boyish impatience. "Well, Mr. Gilder, have you got much farther with the mystery?" "There is no mystery," replied Gilder, as he looked under dreamy eyelids at the rooks. "Well, there is for me, at any rate," said Merton, smiling. "It is simple enough, my boy," observed the senior investigator, stroking his grey-pointed beard. "3 minutes after you had gone for Mr. Royce's parson, the whole thing came out. You know that pasty-faced servant in the black gloves who stopped the train?" "I should know him anywhere. Somehow he rather gave me the creeps." "Well," drawled Gilder, "when the train had gone on again, that man had gone too. Rather a cool criminal, don't you think, to escape by the very train that went off for the police?" "You're pretty sure, I suppose," remarked the young man, "that he really did kill his master?" "Yes, my son, I'm pretty sure," replied Gilder dryly, "for the trifling reason that he has gone off with £20,000 in papers that were in his master's desk. No, the only thing worth calling a difficulty is how he killed him. The skull seems broken as with some big weapon, but there's no weapon at all lying about, and the murderer would have found it awkward to carry it away, unless the weapon was too small to be noticed." "Perhaps the weapon was too big to be noticed," said the priest, with an odd little giggle. Gilder looked round at this wild remark, and rather sternly asked Brown what he meant. "Silly way of putting it, I know," said Father Brown apologetically. "Sounds like a fairy tale, but poor Armstrong was killed with a giant's club, a great green club, too big to be seen, and which we call the earth. He was broken against this green bank we are standing on." "How do you mean?" asked the detective quickly. Father Brown turned his moon face up to the narrow facade of the house, and blinked hopelessly up. Following his eyes, they saw that right at the top of this otherwise blind back quarter of the building, an attic window stood open. "Don't you see?" he explained, pointing a little awkwardly like a child. "He was thrown down from there." Gilder frowningly scrutinized the window, and then said, "Well, it is certainly possible, but I don't see why you are so sure about it." Brown opened his grey eyes wide. "Why?" he said. "There's a bit of rope round the dead man's leg. Don't you see that other bit of rope up there, caught at the corner of the window?" At that height the thing looked like the faintest particle of dust or hair, but the shrewd old investigator was satisfied. "You're quite right, sir," he said to Father Brown. "That is certainly one to you." Almost as he spoke, a special train with one carriage took the curve of the line on their left, and, stopping, disgorged another group of policemen, in whose midst was the hang-dog visage of Magnus, the absconded servant. "By Jove, they've got him!" cried Gilder, and stepped forward with quite a new alertness. "Have you got the money?" he cried to the first policeman. The man looked him in the face with a rather curious expression and said, "No." Then he added, "At least, not here."
"Which is the inspector, please?"
asked the man called Magnus. When he spoke, everyone instantly understood how this voice had stopped a train. He was a dull-looking man with flat black hair, a colourless face, and a faint suggestion of the East in the level slits in his eyes and mouth. His blood and name, indeed, had remained dubious ever since Sir Aaron had rescued him from a waitership in a London restaurant, and, as some said, from more infamous things. But his voice was as vivid as his face was dead. Whether through exactitude in a foreign language, or in deference to his master, who had been somewhat deaf, Magnus's tones had a peculiarly ringing and piercing quality, and the whole group quite jumped when he spoke.
"I always knew this would happen," he said aloud, with brazen blandness. "My poor old master made game of me for wearing black, but I always said I should be ready for his funeral."
And he made a momentary movement with his two dark-gloved hands.
"Sergeant," said Inspector Gilder, eyeing the black hands with wrath, "aren't you putting the bracelets on this fellow? He looks pretty dangerous."
"Well, sir," said the sergeant, with the same odd look of wonder, "I don't know that we can."
"What do you mean?" asked the other sharply. "Haven't you arrested him?"
A faint scorn widened the slit-like mouth, and the whistle of an approaching train seemed oddly to echo the mockery.
"We arrested him," replied the sergeant gravely, "just as he was coming out of the police station at Highgate, where he had deposited all his master's money in the care of Inspector Robinson."
Gilder looked at the manservant in utter amazement.
"Why on earth did you do that?" he asked of Magnus. "To keep it safe from the criminal, of course," replied that person placidly. "Surely," said Gilder, "Sir Aaron's money might have been safely left with Sir Aaron's family."
The tail of his sentence was drowned in the roar of the train as it went rocking and clanking, but through all the hell of noises to which that unhappy house was periodically subject, they could hear the syllables of Magnus's answer in all their bell-like distinctness.
"I have no reason to feel confidence in Sir Aaron's family."
All the motionless men had the ghostly sensation of the presence of some new person, and Merton was scarcely surprised when he looked up and saw the pale face of Armstrong's daughter over Father Brown's shoulder. She was still young and beautiful in a silvery style, but her hair was of so dusty and hueless a brown that in some shadows it seemed to have turned totally grey.
"Be careful what you say," said Royce gruffly. "You'll frighten Miss Armstrong." "I hope so," said the man with the clear voice.
As the woman winced and everyone else wondered, he went on.
"I'm somewhat used to Miss Armstrong's tremors. I've seen her trembling off and on for years, and some said she was shaking with cold, and some said she was shaking with fear, but I know she was shaking with hate and wicked anger, fiends that have had their feast this morning. She would have been away by now with her lover and all the money, but for me, ever since my poor old master prevented her from marrying that tipsy blackguard—" "Stop," said Gilder very sternly. "We have nothing to do with your family fancies or suspicions. Unless you have some practical evidence, your mere opinions—" "Oh, I'll give you practical evidence," cut in Magnus in his hacking accent. "You'll have to subpoena me, Mr. Inspector, and I shall have to tell the truth, and the truth is this. An instant after the old man was pitched bleeding out of the window, I ran into the attic and found his daughter swooning on the floor with a red dagger still in her hand. Allow me to hand that also to the proper authorities."
He took from his tail pocket a long horn-hilted knife with a red smear on it, and handed it politely to the sergeant. Then he stood back again, and his slits of eyes almost faded from his face in one fat Chinese sneer. Merton felt an almost bodily sickness at the sight of him, and he muttered to Gilder, "Surely you would take Miss Armstrong's word against his?" Father Brown suddenly lifted a face so absurdly fresh that it looked somehow as if he had just washed it. "Yes," he said, radiating innocence, "but is Miss Armstrong's word against his?" The girl uttered a startled, singular little cry. Everyone looked at her. Her figure was rigid, as if paralyzed. Only her face, within its frame of faint brown hair, was alive with an appalling surprise. She stood like one, of a sudden, lassoed and throttled.
"This man," said Mr. Gilder gravely, "actually says that you were found grasping a knife, insensible, after the murder."
"He says the truth," answered Alice. The next fact of which they were conscious was that Patrick Royce strode with his great stooping head into their ring and uttered the singular words, "Well, if I've got to go, I'll have a bit of pleasure first." His huge shoulder heaved, and he sent an iron fist smash into Magnus's bland Mongolian visage, laying him on the lawn as flat as a starfish. 2 or 3 of the police instantly put their hands on Royce, but to the rest it seemed as if all reason had broken up, and the universe were turning into a brainless harlequinade.
"None of that, Mr. Royce," Gilder had called out authoritatively. "I shall arrest you for assault." "No, you won't," answered the secretary in a voice like an iron gong. "You will arrest me for murder."
Gilder threw an alarmed glance at the man knocked down, but since that outraged person was already sitting up and wiping a little blood off a substantially uninjured face, he only said shortly, "What do you mean?" "It is quite true, as this fellow says," explained Royce, "that Miss Armstrong fainted with a knife in her hand. But she had not snatched the knife to attack her father, but to defend him."
"To defend him?" repeated Gilder gravely. "Against whom?"
"Against me," answered the secretary. Alice looked at him with a complex and baffling face. Then she said in a low voice, "After it all, I am still glad you are brave."
"Come upstairs," said Patrick Royce heavily, "and I will show you the whole cursed thing."
The attic, which was the secretary's private place, and rather a small cell for so large a hermit, had indeed all the vestiges of a violent drama. Near the centre of the floor lay a large revolver, as if flung away. Nearer to the left was rolled a whisky bottle, open but not quite empty. The cloth of the little table lay dragged and trampled, and a length of cord, like that found on the corpse, was cast wildly across the window-sill. 2 vases were smashed on the mantelpiece, and 1 on the carpet. "I was drunk," said Royce, and this simplicity in the prematurely battered man somehow had the pathos of the first sin of a baby. "You all know about me," he continued huskily. "Everybody knows how my story began, and it may as well end like that too. I was called a clever man once, and might have been a happy one. Armstrong saved the remains of a brain and body from the taverns, and was always kind to me in his own way, poor fellow. Only he wouldn't let me marry Alice here, and it will always be said that he was right enough. Well, you can form your own conclusions, and you won't want me to go into details.
That is my whisky bottle, half emptied in the corner. That is my revolver, quite emptied, on the carpet. It was the rope from my box that was found on the corpse, and it was from my window the corpse was thrown. You need not set detectives to grub up my tragedy. It is a common enough weed in this world. I give myself to the gallows, and by God, that is enough."
At a sufficiently delicate sign, the police gathered round the large man to lead him away. But their unobtrusiveness was somewhat staggered by the remarkable appearance of Father Brown, who was on his hands and knees on the carpet in the doorway, as if engaged in some kind of undignified prayers. Being a person utterly insensible to the social figure he cut, he remained in this posture, but turned a bright round face up at the company, presenting the appearance of a quadruped with a very comic human head. "I say," he said good-naturedly, "this really won't do at all, you know. At the beginning you said we'd found no weapon, but now we're finding too many. There's the knife to stab, and the rope to strangle, and the pistol to shoot, and after all, he broke his neck by falling out of a window. It won't do. It's not economical." And he shook his head at the ground as a horse does grazing. Inspector Gilder had opened his mouth with serious intentions, but before he could speak, the grotesque figure on the floor had gone on quite volubly. "And now 3 quite impossible things. First, these holes in the carpet where the 6 bullets have gone in. Why on earth should anybody fire at the carpet? A drunken man lets fly at his enemy's head, the thing that's grinning at him. He doesn't pick a quarrel with his feet or lay siege to his slippers. And then there's the rope." And having done with the carpet, the speaker lifted his hands and put them in his pocket, but continued, unaffectedly, on his knees. "In what conceivable intoxication would anybody try to put a rope round a man's neck and finally put it round his leg? Royce, anyhow, was not so drunk as that, or he would be sleeping like a log by now. And, plainest of all, the whisky bottle. You suggest a dipsomaniac fought for the whisky bottle, and then, having won, rolled it away in a corner, spilling one half and leaving the other. That is the very last thing a dipsomaniac would do." He scrambled awkwardly to his feet and said to the self-accused murderer, in tones of limpid penitence, "I'm awfully sorry, my dear sir, but your tale is really rubbish." "Sir," said Alice Armstrong in a low tone to the priest, "can I speak to you alone for a moment?" This request forced the communicative cleric out of the gangway, and before he could speak in the next room, the girl was talking with strange incisiveness. "You are a clever man," she said, "and you are trying to save Patrick, I know. But it's no use. The core of all this is black, and the more things you find out, the more there will be against the miserable man I love." "Why?" asked Brown, looking at her steadily. "Because," she answered, equally steadily, "I saw him commit the crime myself." "Ah," said the unmoved Brown. "And what did he do?" "I was in this room next to them," she explained. "Both doors were closed, but I suddenly heard a voice, such as I had never heard on earth, roaring, 'Hell! Hell! Hell!' again and again, and then the 2 doors shook with the first explosion of the revolver. Thrice again the thing banged before I got the 2 doors open and found the room full of smoke, but the pistol was smoking in my poor mad Patrick's hand, and I saw him fire the last murderous volley with my own eyes. Then he leapt on my father, who was clinging in terror to the window-sill, and, grappling, tried to strangle him with the rope, which he threw over his head, but which slipped over his struggling shoulders to his feet. Then it tightened round one leg, and Patrick dragged him along like a maniac. I snatched a knife from the mat and, rushing between them, managed to cut the rope before I fainted." "I see," said Father Brown with the same wooden civility. "Thank you." As the girl collapsed under her memories, the priest passed stiffly into the next room, where he found Gilder and Merton alone with Patrick Royce, who sat in a chair, handcuffed. "There," he said to the inspector submissively, "might I say a word to the prisoner in your presence, and might he take off those funny cuffs for a minute?" "He is a very powerful man," said Merton in an undertone. "Why do you want them taken off?" "Why, I thought," replied the priest humbly, "that perhaps I might have the very great honour of shaking hands with him." Both detectives stared, and Father Brown added, "Won't you tell them about it, sir?" The man on the chair shook his tousled head, and the priest turned impatiently. "Then I will," he said. "Private lives are more important than public reputations. I am going to save the living, and let the dead bury their dead." He went to the fatal window, and blinked out of it as he went on talking. "I told you that in this case there were too many weapons, and only one death. I tell you now that they were not weapons, and were not used to cause death. All those grisly tools, the noose, the bloody knife, the exploding pistol, were instruments of a curious mercy. They were not used to kill Sir Aaron, but to save him."
"To save him?" repeated Gilder. "And from what?"
"From himself," said Father Brown. "He was a suicidal maniac." "What?" cried Merton, in an incredulous tone. "And the religion of cheerfulness?" "It is a cruel religion," said the priest, looking out of the window. "Why couldn't they let him weep a little, like his fathers before him? His plans stiffened, his views grew cold. Behind that merry mask was the empty mind of the atheist. At last, to keep up his hilarious public level, he fell back on that dram-drinking he had abandoned long ago. But there is this horror about alcoholism in a sincere teetotaler, that he pictures and expects that psychological inferno from which he has warned others. It leapt upon poor Armstrong prematurely, and by this morning he was in such a case that he sat here and cried he was in hell, in so crazy a voice that his daughter did not know it. He was mad for death, and with the monkey tricks of the mad, he had scattered round him death in many shapes, a running noose, and his friend's revolver, and a knife. Royce entered accidentally, and acted in a flash. He flung the knife on the mat behind him, snatched up the revolver, and having no time to unload it, emptied it, shot after shot, all over the floor. The suicide saw a fourth shape of death, and made a dash for the window. The rescuer did the only thing he could, ran after him with the rope, and tried to tie him hand and foot. Then it was that the unlucky girl ran in, and, misunderstanding the struggle, strove to slash her father free. At first she only slashed poor Royce's knuckles, from which has come all the little blood in this affair. But, of course, you noticed that he left blood but no wound on that servant's face. Only before the poor woman swooned, she did hack her father loose, so that he went crashing through that window into eternity. There was a long stillness, slowly broken by the metallic noises of Gilder unlocking the handcuffs of Patrick Royce, to whom he said, "I think I should have told the truth, sir. You and the young lady are worth more than Armstrong's obituary notices." "Confound Armstrong's notices!" cried Royce roughly. "Don't you see? It was because she mustn't know." "Mustn't know what?" asked Merton. "Why, that she killed her father, you fool," roared the other. "He'd have been alive now, but for her. It might craze her to know that." "No, I don't think it would," remarked Father Brown as he picked up his hat. "I rather think I should tell her. Even the most murderous blunders don't poison life like sins. Anyhow, I think you may both be the happier now. I've got to go back to the deaf school." As he went out onto the gusty grass, an acquaintance from Highgate stopped him and said, "The coroner has arrived. The inquiry is just going to begin." "I've got to get back to the deaf school," said Father Brown. "I'm sorry, I can't stop for the inquiry."